So, first and foremost, we are discussing the mental health of mental health professionals. And here today with me, I have three renowned psychologists, Dr. Grace Manso-Owusu, Dr. Fabian Palmer, and Dr. Abdullah Mia. And first, I would like to introduce Dr. Grace Manso-Owusu, who has already said hi. She's a director on the BiPP network. But beyond this, she's also an organizational psychologist with a master's in occupational psychology, a PhD in management studies, and a postgraduate diploma in counseling and psychotherapy. She has worked with a variety of organizations across research, academia, and human resources. And her current project is focused on talent management, where she helps people to be the best that can be within the workplace. Hi, Dr. Grace.
Hi, Keisha. Thank you for that great introduction. Every time I hear about introductions, I'm always like, oh yeah, that's me. So yeah, my opening statement will start around who I am. As you know, I am an organizational psychologist, so I work specifically within workplaces to optimize people's kind of working lives. But I've also finished training as a psychotherapist. I finished the course, which is a postgraduate diploma in 2020 technically, but I finished placement in 2021 working during COVID. So my course started virtually, face-to-face, and ended virtually. And that meant that I had to see clients as a trainee all the way through the pandemic. And that was really interesting to see both sides of the coin, me being a mental health practitioner, but also helping people through something we've never seen or heard of before. I would say, I'll be talking about this later on, but one of the key things for myself was basically having self-awareness of my own boundaries and barriers, but also being aware of other people's comfort with the digital world, because a lot of services went digital very, very fast. So working with people who might not have been used to digital counselling, as well as working with people in the workplace that also would not have been used to a hybrid or a 100% virtual environment. COVID as well was something that was everyone was aware of it. So a lot of people got affected directly and indirectly, and that included practitioners as well as clients. So yes, that's my main opening statement. Being self-aware, being aware of your boundaries as a practitioner, and being also aware of cues within clients is also something I would say is important, but I'll probably talk about that a little bit more later on.
Thank you so much, Grace. And then next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Fabian Palmer, who is a director, chartered senior clinical psychologist, supervisor, and trainer, who specializes in trauma as well as workplace and organizational well-being. She is passionate about supporting and developing trainee clinical psychologists and has worked with the NHS Trust and training courses, including UEL, UCL, University of Essex, the University of Hertfordshire, and IOP, to improve access, representation, and feelings of belonging for those who belong to minoritized and racialized groups. Good afternoon, Fabian.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for that introduction, and yeah, very similar feelings to what Grace was describing, thinking who is she talking about? But thank you, it's an honor to be here and to kind of think about something that is very close to my heart. At the moment, my main kind of area of work, I work in the NHS, is within occupational health and well-being. So I'm really kind of thinking a lot about what impacts on the well-being of staff, the sort of emotional and psychological well-being of NHS frontline staff in particular. And, you know, it's such a resonant and important topic to think about, because it can be generalised. We can think about this across the sectors, but there is, I suppose, you know, thinking about the stereotype or the kind of features that I kind of think about with mental health practitioners or kind of frontline practitioners. There's something about, you know, really wanting to help other people and sort of viewing yourself as kind of having something hopefully valuable and useful to offer somebody who's in need, and you know, being in a position where you are entrusted with that person's kind of stories and their experiences, and you know, you carry a lot of hope for them as well, that things can be better. So there's something about you know, just that profile of person, you know, having to kind of be strong, having to be the one that's looked upon for the answers, the one that kind of does the fixing and, you know, facilitating and supporting. It's been, you know, both being a practitioner myself, but also working alongside other practitioners, thinking about, you know, when you're in a global crisis, you know, and there's so many things that have happened during and alongside the pandemic, when you're in that, what's your toolkit? You know, what are you drawing on to regulate yourself? Because we know so much about how we are feeling is going to impact on the outcomes, on the, you know, the outcomes of the people that we're working with. So when I think about, like, where does the key lie, what needs to happen, or, you know, how do we even make sense of what practitioners need, or what mental health services need to think more about, is the societal kind of context of what's going on in society, and, like, is there a role for activism and sort of being much more politically inclined, and, you know, drawing people out to really fight for what's needed for themselves and for their clients, you know, normalizing and contextualizing people's distress. So the things that we notice in our clients, we may be kind of being a lot more in touch with ourselves, because we're all human and we're all struggling to kind of figure all of these really big and confusing things out together. So thinking about, you know, the humanity, us as citizens, us as people, us as communities, are there solutions that we can find together to kind of improve how we feel? And then I suppose thinking about organisations, what sorts of cultures and values and visions are kind of being named and performed, and, you know, what are people authentically engaging with, like, what do they actually believe in, and what do they feel they have the power to kind of enact? Is it all for show, or is there something real about it? And I guess it's about managers and, you know, individual kind of responsibilities, individual responses as well to their experiences. How are they valued, and how are they kind of held in mind? So I'm sort of coming at it from more of a systemic and sort of, you know, trying to deconstruct some of our ideas around distress, but it feels like a very big and important topic. So hopefully we'll be able to talk more about it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabienne. And I do like the mention of the societal impacts and how we try to impact that as practitioners, as mental health professionals as well. Definitely looking forward to hear more about that. And last but not least, we want to introduce Dr. Abdullah Mia, who's, I think, a first as well on one of our BIP Network events. Abdullah is a consultant clinical psychologist within an NHS male medium secure unit in Birmingham. He's interested in amplifying oppressed voices, creating change and shining a light on alternative psychological narratives. This involves the valuing and building of networks of resistance against conscious and unconscious anxious attachments, which can lead to abuses of power and authority. In particular, Abdullah focuses on how institutional and systematic racism impacts upon the mental health of employees and people who use services. Welcome, Abdullah.
Hiya, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for everyone. I hope I can say a little bit about this. It's really interesting when we talk about the mental health of mental health professionals. I often think that we can already start to split ourselves off as if it's something different and a different way of being. And that very positioning leads itself to thinking about what we do differently right from the start. And I think one of the things that we do is that we start to internalize an idea that because we are mental health professionals, we should know better, and we should do better, and we should feel different. So we start to deny our own experiences. And then what makes it worse is that they can often link in with our own historical experiences of being silenced and oppression. The challenge with that all can be that if no one speaks up, then everyone goes about their business as if I'm the only weirdo here who's feeling wrong or different. And then you never end up getting any kind of feedback as to whether it's okay. So one of the things I think is really important when we think about mental health professionals is how do we, as a group and a organization across the NHS and broader, how do we communicate and normalize the idea of distress within our own group? But within that as well, thinking about who has got access to more powerful and dominant narratives that can allow those conversations to take place. So it's often around, for me, taking the step of going, actually, do you think it might be this? Getting it wrong, maybe offending people, right? And people turn around and telling me, actually, no, you are way off the mark here. I'm totally fine, right? Or talking about the idea of actually, I hope, so some of the people on the conference today I have met in some capacity, and I hope they know that I'm also quite open to the idea of talking about when I get angry, or when I get upset, or when I get frustrated. And I suppose an anecdote that I will share is, I was once, back in 2013-14, I was starting to teach about certain topics, and I used to get distressed and upset about it, and it was often around racial trauma and things. And I found myself thinking, gosh, I need to go into therapy to stop myself from being upset. Whereas the reality is that actually being upset about racial trauma and racism is totally appropriate. And I think the one thing that we need to start thinking about in particular is, how do we normalize the experiences of what people have gone through and what they've experienced, whilst also then thinking about adapting services to create a culture where those conversations can happen and highlight the inequalities that happen, and then coming together as a group to go, right, how are we going to have a joint stance on this, as opposed to it being located in the individual. I suppose I'd stop there.
Thank you, Abdullah. And I think one thing that you've all touched upon is this stereotype that exists for how mental health professionals should be regarding supporting their own well-being, perhaps this image that they must portray that they necessarily don't have, or they do have a good well-being, and how this manifests or how this affects the relationships with clients or their own work practices as well. And with that, I want to read out a quote from Kumar Khan Singh, who essentially said that society expects the mental health professionals to be patient, caring, strong, motivating, readily available, free from stress and frustrations at the time of need, but simultaneously stigmatizes psychiatry and mental health professionals. And in this situation, the mental health professionals' mental health gets grossly ignored, and they often fail to seek adequate help for themselves, possibly out of the faulty belief that as experts, they should deal with their mental health problems on their own. And with that, I guess I pose this question to you all, which is, how do you think the stereotype of mental health professionals and this stigma as well of mental health overall affect mental health professionals' help-seeking behaviour? And I know, Abdullah, you touched on this very briefly in your opening statement, but I think let's start with Grace, if you want to open up, and then we can broaden out as well.
Thank you, Keisha. I think that quote is really pertinent because it does show like the juxtaposition and the contrast between what mental health professionals think they should be sometimes, and if they absorb the stereotypes of kind of like the perfect helper, and what actually happens in reality, which is, you know, everybody has their own things to deal with. Everybody has been affected by the environment over the last 2 years specifically, but in general, people's lived experiences of trauma, of racism, of poverty, etc. So bringing all of that into a very intense environment of what we saw, what we started to see 2 years ago, nearly exactly, is, and then adding the pressure of you should be the perfect healer, you should have it all together. It's a lot of pressure on mental health practitioners. And I'm going to use an example of, you know, and forgive me, Jessica, of medical doctors who, you know, often have the stereotype of a medical doctor. In reality is that they have poor physical health and they do not seek help, and often have a lot of ailments. And again, that's probably, I'm not sure how accurate that is now, but that's definitely a thought that sprung to mind when you said that quote. So about how do we actually jump out of this? How do we become much more informed, but also compassionate towards ourselves? I think it's about being realistic, and I think with ourselves and our peers, providing spaces where we can share our personal struggles, before we get into the room with clients, how are we actually feeling, checking in with ourselves, having supervision, being able to be aware of transference and counter-transference in the room. All of those things are really important as to how you grow as a person, but also as a practitioner, because actually being true and honest with yourself at the time, just so you don't cause harm or extra harm, is really, really important, and not only to clients, but also to ourselves. So yeah, really just making ourselves aware of what exactly is going on with us and seeking that help. You know, a lot of therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists are encouraged to seek mental health support themselves, should be in regular supervision, but also be able to check in with themselves and check in their feelings and kind of self-soothe to a certain extent as well. So yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you, Grace. And Fabienne, I wondered if you also had a piece to add to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Grace has shared is so resonant, and I think really looking at you know, what we can do on an individual level to really sort of get the support that we need, or to kind of normalize, or yeah, like help us to not feel so alone with our kind of feelings and our experiences, is really important. And something that I've been really thinking about, both on a sort of personal level and also kind of in terms of the people that I'm coming into contact with in my day-to-day work, is kind of like, what happens to people, you know, when they have that excitement, that enthusiasm, that interest in kind of working in healthcare or kind of providing support to others. Sometimes people are really aware of how to look after themselves, like they know what they need to do. And then, you know, they come to see me, or they kind of get to a point where they're being referred to a service like mine because things have really broken down and things are really difficult. And I sort of think about how power operates, you know, like the you know, the healthcare system is a really big system. It's a really complex system, and it's going to have lots of competing demands and lots of things that, you know, aren't necessarily going to be in the interest of the individual employee. It's kind of got outcomes and things that it needs to produce. And so I'm sort of thinking about, you know, I'm thinking about myself kind of going into organizations and teams being very excited about well-being. Like, how can we, you know, bring well-being into our workplace? You know, what sorts of things have I learned that I could apply in this context that would really help, you know, with productivity, with feelings of connectedness, with a sense of shared identity and vision and values. You know, these are things that are really important to me. And actually, my experience has been that there isn't time to do that. There isn't really an interest in that, and there isn't really, you know, sometimes even it's even though it for me, it very clearly connects with the visions and values of an organisation, it's just not a priority. So I'm kind of thinking about who kind of decides, you know, what sorts of things are allowed to happen within a team or for an individual, and then what's the impact on that individual that's kind of come in with that energy and excitement and, you know, really wanting to make a difference, when the system's kind of saying not here or not today. So there's something about definitely finding peers and finding other people who have that energy and not wanting, like, you know, not feeling like there's anything wrong with you as an individual if you kind of go into a space really wanting to protect or put boundaries around your mental health and your well-being, even if it's counter to the narrative of like, we must work ourselves to the bone, and, you know, if you're not seen to be kind of doing any work, then you must be failing, or there must be something wrong with you. Kind of re-evaluating or kind of thinking in a different way about what work actually is. So when we're kind of slowing things down, when we're having conversations, when we're connecting with one another, when we're going out for a walk because it's sunny, or getting an ice cream, you know, these are all still part of work. And trying to find ways of getting that message lifted is going to maybe be challenging depending on the context that you're in, but just thinking creatively about what does well-being actually mean or look like to me, and how how can I go about that, whilst also holding in mind, especially, you know, depending on your intersectional identity, there may be very real things that are impacting on how much power you feel to kind of even share these things, think these things privately or otherwise. So it's a very complex kind of ongoing thing, but actually having spaces to wonder about these things. And, you know, as Abdullah was saying about not locating that in the individual, kind of thinking, how is this fitting into the bigger picture? Like what else needs to be held in mind for this to really make sense, and, you know, not kind of forget about the broader impacts that might be shaping people's experiences. They're the sorts of things that were kind of coming to me when I was listening to that quote and what Grace shared as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabienne. And I most certainly empathise with the want to go into an organisation and implement initiatives to support staff's wellbeing, but quickly realising that the dynamics of the organisation or the resources can sometimes not allow that to happen. So thank you. And then last, I'll go to Abdullah as well, if you wanted to add any or develop on some of your ideas and thoughts that you had earlier regarding this quote.
Thanks. I think there's something around what Fabienne said around what's allowed to happen and who decides. And for me, I think whether it's by nature of being from a minoritized community or my own upbringing, I think what I found really useful is learning those rules very quickly, but then also learning that actually that you can try and push those boundaries, and you must try and push those boundaries. And the worst case scenario is somebody needs to pluck up the courage to come and tell you that you're a bit of a boundary pusher, except people don't tend to do that. The fear of being told that often stops us. And when they do tell us, it can come in an aggressive form. But up until that point, it's about trying to get things done. When you both spoke, Grace and Fabienne, I think what really came to mind was bell hooks. Bell hooks is teaching to transgress is the thing that first came to mind, around the idea that actually we're meant to be pushing boundaries, we're meant to be speaking up around those narratives. And as an outsider consulting to organizations, I think it's easier to be then scapegoated, but then be able to use that to speak truth. As an insider within the organization, there's a lot more fear, and how you're supported in that fear, but also, and it's rightful, it can result in a lot of jeopardy. I think there's something around where you pick, I would go about, actually not we, where I'd go about picking my allies and speaking about it with my allies to think about how you'd be able to do a coordinated kind of approach to it.
Thank you, Abdullah. And I think before I go on to my next question, I wanted to encourage anyone in the floor currently, so from the audience, to also, if they had a question, either raise their hand or type it in the chat for us to direct it to the speakers. If not, I think I want to touch upon a point that was made earlier about this need when you're a mental health practitioner, particularly someone who's from a racialized minority background, to not only deal with or cope with the distress or the trauma that is being experienced or being seen, but also have to support clients at the same time who are also coping or managing with the distress. And I particularly refer to during COVID-19 pandemic, where we had the tragic death of George Floyd in the Black Lives Matter protest. Many mental health professionals were not only having to respond to the racial trauma, but also have to support individuals that were experiencing racial trauma. So I guess my question to you all would be, how was that experience as mental health professionals or practitioners? And what do you think needs to change within the system in order to better equip not only the professionals to support individuals who are experiencing racial trauma, but to support yourselves as well? And I think I'll just let anyone, Fabienne, Grace, or Abdullah, just unmute yourselves to speak first. Tibush.
I'll go first. I think it's an interesting question because for me, a lot of things came out of the forefront. However, in my non-therapist working life, it's the kind of thing that I've been talking about for a long time. So it wasn't, for me, new to say. It was just that a lot of people were looking to hear what myself and other Black people were going to say on the topic. And I found that very interesting because, it did kind of develop, I developed a lot of feelings of kind of frustration, and I was quite irritated, to be honest. However, in the room with clients, I felt like because we were already talking about those topics, they were very real, they already were in the room. It wasn't any more than I'd already faced before that point. So actually sitting in a room one-on-one with a client, talking about their minoritized experiences, for me, is much more of a comfortable place for me, actually, because I felt like I could be a help more so, not really necessarily to the detriment of myself. Whereas in my day-to-day job, I felt like it was the opposite. So it's an interesting dichotomy there. And one that I hadn't really thought about, but I think supporting clients and people from especially racially minoritized, but all other minoritized groups within mental health practitioners, especially on a one-to-one basis, for me is, I suppose, a place of liberation and support for the clients, because you can talk about those things in the room. There's nobody else there. So people can feel, especially with somebody who might represent to them comfort, familiarity as well, which they might not have with other practitioners that don't necessarily look like them or represent a similar background. So for me, it felt much more empowering in that setting than in other settings.
Thank you, Grace. And Fabienne or Abdullah, I wanted to know if you also wanted to add before we go to a question that's gone into the chat as well.
I'm happy to go next, or did you want to go next, Abdullah? Okay. It's really interesting hearing you say that, Grace. Thank you for sharing. I think I had a really different experience, and I think it might have had something to do with the timing of when I finished my clinical training, because I was probably just over a year out of training, and I had these really big kind of like dreams of traveling and doing loads of stuff in that year after qualifying. And I did some traveling, and then COVID hit. And, you know, even though my thesis was very much about, you know, Black service users, or, you know, Black people and the appropriateness of mental health services across the UK, I was really interested and immersed in kind of racism and, you know, what it all means in psychology. I was really questioning of my identity as a psychologist and kind of thinking, what has my course taught me? I've been in this very kind of Eurocentric training course that hasn't added the sorts of insights that I might expect to have come out with the training having for issues around race and identity. Like, I think I came with that, you know, it was somewhat a space to kind of experiment and wonder, but I sort of became very doubtful of my capacity to kind of be a clinical psychologist working, you know, in a clinical psychologist way with like racial trauma, or, you know, even thinking about the intersection with race and COVID and the sort of inequalities and injustices that were really highlighted at that time. So I found myself, I just started my private practice at the time, around the time of George Floyd's murder, and I was receiving an influx of inquiries from, you know, Black clients wanting to talk about race and wanting to talk about racism, and I felt like I had to. It was like I couldn't not offer a space. You know, like, what would that mean if I said no, or if I kind of had difficult feelings about that? And, you know, my previous working context was working with children who had experienced sexual abuse. So I'd kind of gone from really intense trauma in my sort of day-to-day work to then, you know, in my sort of evening work or like kind of outside of NHS work, another type of trauma, like very specific type of trauma. So I actually felt very flooded, but also unable to say no, to like turn down any work. I felt very kind of torn about even being able to kind of manage my own well-being. I felt like I really needed to help and offer, and very quickly got quite burnt out, because it's just not something that you can constantly be exposed to. Like there has to be some variety in one's caseload, actually, really, to kind of be able, my sense is, to be able to kind of do the work well. Working at an extremely high level of trauma all the time actually isn't very good as a practitioner. But I just thought that was something I was like, I just have to do it. Like there's no question about it. I just have to do it. Even if I don't have space, I'll find space, I'll see people. And I just felt really quite overwhelmed. And I found a balance now, but actually there is something, I think, about the way that we're trained to kind of respond to deprivation, to respond to distress, to kind of feel that our tolerance levels should be really high, and that we should just sort of take everything. And and even with supervision, it was such a new situation. I suppose it felt like a very important process to go through at that point in my career, but certainly one that I felt I learned a lot from, and felt very moved by, but it was also very difficult. So it's useful to hear that other people had kind of different experiences as well.
Thank you, Fabienne, and thank you for not only sharing your experience, but also enlightening us on the fact that a lot of practitioners probably felt that they had to support, they had to help individuals who were experiencing racial trauma, because also who else would do it, essentially? Who else in the system could be somewhat aware or knowledgeable on some of the experiences they had beyond other, at times, racialized minorities practitioners? So thank you. We have 2 minutes left for this panel discussion. And I wondered, Abdul, if you wanted to quickly add any additions to this talk or to what the topic is now, before I just quickly read out some comments to the chat from the chat.
I think we can go straight into the comment from the chat. I think the only thing I will say is over time, I've learned the importance of saying no to myself and to other people, and not feeling like I have to justify why I'm saying no. Because when I start to feel I have to justify saying no, it feels like my guilt kicks in about why I'm saying no. But that self-preservation is really important sometimes.
Definitely. And then with that, I would quickly go to the comments in the chat. So Miss Trose, I think it's Miss Trose, she or he particularly talks about the use of God and prayer and religion when supporting your own mental health and helping yourselves to perhaps deal with some of the various circumstances or various issues that patients or service users might mention. And then also Jenny, who identifies as a she, also talks about LGBTQ clients and how essentially during the COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd, whilst this was happening, how she perhaps struggled or also gave the opportunity to clients who were LGBTQ and had racial trauma to speak. And I guess quickly, I'd open the floor to any further comments you might have on what they've mentioned, perhaps experiences or what you think could be done to help address or support, if it's relating to experiences of religion when it comes to mental health practice and your own mental health, or also when supporting LGBT clients who are also from racialized minority background. I'll just open the floor to Abdullah, Fabienne, or Grace if you wanted to comment.
I'm happy to go first. Right. So the thing about, interestingly, it's usually within my private practice, and that I see people from usually an ethnic minority and male background who are thinking about what it means to them to think about what their sexuality is and things, and how that intersection falls in line with their religious beliefs and their cultural beliefs and things. And within that, it was really interesting. There was a conversation this morning in a meeting about a piece of research that's been conducted with Muslim men who are gay, and how that is navigated through in conversations, and the idea that both communities can sometimes be really rejecting and isolating of people. And one of the things that I think we need to really focus on is, how do you help people connect with who they are, regardless of the environment that they find themselves in? And then once they've got into a sound foundation there, how do we help them connect with how they engage with various communities? We can't encourage people to not be aware of the trauma that they'll experience, because we don't live in a utopian world. Therefore, it's about how they manage those aggressions or those challenges, and without it being internalized to an element of who they are. And I think that's the biggest part of it. How do you flip the narrative around from the problem being located within the individual to thinking about how the problem is located within the system, and also acclimatizing to the idea that actually sometimes it's not always possible to address the systemic and institutional problems, but that normalizing of it and trying to once again find out other spaces where they can connect with.
Thank you for sharing that, Abdullah, and how important it is for clients to be able to be their true selves, particularly in the therapeutic relationship. I just want to say thank you to Dr. Fabian and Dr. Grace and Dr. Abdullah for being here today and for sharing their thoughts on this important topic on the mental health of mental health professionals. It was very enlightening, particularly touching upon the stereotype and this double stigma, how we also support clients who are experiencing trauma and distress that we might also be affected by as well. So I'd give a little round of applause for them. And then, thank you. And hopefully we'll see you back here at the networking event later on, but if not, farewell as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, we're going to take a 2-minute break and then we're going to go into our next panel discussion, which will be on students' mental health. Okay, welcome back everyone. Idris, could you please share your slides for me? Perfect. Thank you very much. So our next panel discussion will be talking about students' mental health, particularly how students experience their mental health across COVID-19 and up till today, and how our services at universities are competent or able to support them. With that, I want to introduce our speakers for today's panel discussion. In advance, I want to apologise that Georgia May Webster is not here today. She was unable to attend. So our first speaker is Nakasi Stoll, who is a final year ESRC funded doctoral researcher in psychological medicine research at King's College London. And she's also a research associate at Advanced HE. Her research centres around exploring and supporting the mental health and wellbeing of Black students in UK universities. And she's also the co-founder of Black People Talk and director of Black Students Talk, which designs, delivers, and evaluates peer support interventions for Black students. Welcome, Nakasi.
Thank you. Thanks, Keisha, and everyone for inviting me to speak today. So I thought I'd start my 5-minute opening, which probably won't be 5 minutes, but I thought by starting, be good to kind of speak a little bit about, I guess, what brought me into studying and supporting Black students' mental health. So I myself am a Black student, obviously. I've struggled with my mental health since 2011 when I was an undergrad. I also struggled, like many Black university students, with racism, with classism, sexism, all the isms. And especially back in 2011, there was just no support. Like even, mentioning that, racism can impact your mental health was just completely unknown. So I went through my undergrad and my master's virtually without any support, without anyone really to talk to, and that really had an impact on my mental health. So by the time I got to the end of my master's, I got to a point where I was like, this can't be it. Like, it can't just be me who's struggling. So I decided to speak to some academics at the university I was at, started to speak to some students, and I kind of found out that my experience wasn't unique, but that there was no research and no support services available for people like me. People who were struggling with their mental health, people who also went to predominantly white universities and struggled with the fact that I guess they were I think I was one of 5 of 200 in my undergrad. So yeah, that kind of led me to do my PhD research. So my research project, basically, I asked one question. I asked Black students to talk to me about their mental health journeys. And for a lot of the students I spoke to, so I spoke to 25 overall, pretty much all of them said that it was the first time anyone had ever asked them to talk about their mental health in the context of their race. And because of that, every single student spoke to me for 2+ hours, which, it's weird, like try and speak about something for 2 hours straight. It's not easy, but just because it was such a unique thing for them, it was the first time they were kind of getting it out, they were able to speak for that 2 hours straight. And that to me kind of really hammered home the idea that, Black students get to go through undergrad, go through postgrad, go through their academic journeys basically without the support and without the ability to kind of name some of those experiences that the other panel members were speaking about earlier. And also that we all can kind of pretty much, without even kind of needing any research, we know what it means to be a Black and racialized minority student at university. So that the research that's kind of been conducted, me and the co-founder of Black People Talk, developed Black Students Talk, which is the first and only peer support group for Black university students, national peer support group offered online. We received funding from Student Space. I'm not sure if anyone's aware of it, but it's a program run specifically during the pandemic to support students with their mental health. And we were funded by our Office for Students to run an online peer support group for Black students. And again, it was for many Black students the first kind of space where they've been able to talk about their mental health and well-being in the context of their race, in the context of experiencing racism. It was created by Black students, it was run by Black students, and it was something that a lot of them basically said that they wanted further support in. But of course, as we know, now that, the conversations around racism are kind of dying down a little bit, a lot of students have not been able to have that support anymore. So it's something that we're really looking into at the moment, into how can universities create support services for Black students without, having to shell out a lot of money, but also being able to support as best as possible with the resources that they have. So I'm happy to kind of speak a little bit more about it later, but I guess, yeah, that's my opening statement. I hope that was 5 minutes.
That was perfect. Thank you, Nikasi, and for sharing not only your journey into Black students or Black people talk, but also about highlighting the lack of research and the lack of support services that exist for students who not only experience racialized racism in academia, but also struggle with their mental health and have no resources necessarily available to them. Next, I would like to introduce Celine Error. Is Celine here?
Celine is not yet present.
Okay, well, we'll go on to introduce Deji next, and then if Celine's here, then we can introduce her as well. So Deji is a mental health advisor at a university in London who was previously a forensic mental health practitioner, working on a specialist gangs project that involved conducting mental health assessments and interventions with gang nominals. Deji has also supported the rollout of the Knife Free campaign with the Home Office and has been invited to number 10 Downing Street to celebrate his work with young adults. Deji is involved in numerous consultations with London local authorities, the government, and the Mayor's Office for policing and crime, helping to influence policies on youth violence, knife crime, and mental health. Hi, Deji. He's also, as well, just to add, as mentioned, one of the directors at the BiPP network. Hi, Deji.
Hi, thank you for that. Like sometimes I forget what I've done and I just feel like I haven't achieved anything. But when you collate it like that, it sounds really, really sweet. So yeah, thank you for that, Keisha. I am Deji. I am gonna, like in Cassie, I'm gonna speak a bit about my journey and then give my comment on the topic. So I graduated many years ago now with a psychology degree, and then I went on to be a mental health worker for about a year. Then I went to study my master's in clinical psychology and did some counseling skills on the side. Then I got a job in a school. So it was like my first time in the education sector, working in various schools, mainstream schools, secondaries, primary schools, crews as well, doing mental health assessments and some interventions too, like play therapy and Lego therapy. And that was the first time I got a taste for education and mental health in an educational context. Then I wanted to get a bit more intense experience. So that's when I became a forensic mental health practitioner on the Specialist Gangs project. I was really, really enjoying it, but it was a bit too intense. And I just realized I wanted to return to education. So now I am a mental health practitioner a mental health advisor at a university. Basically been doing the same thing throughout my life, mental health assessments and the interventions where I can squeeze them in on students now, obviously. So yeah, moving on to the topic, I think I've got a very, very first-hand experience of the topic, and I work in student support services. And I started my role while we were in and out of lockdown. So I kind of saw the way the changes was happening. And what I will say is when we first went into the lockdowns, obviously there was a real shift in the way we deliver everything, but there was a focus on the academic support and the teaching, obviously, because at a university, teaching is the main thing. So the student support services and the mental health wellbeing service kind of got lost in all of that. We were kind of like the last to transition or the last to kind of be told how to transition. So that had a really weird effect on the practitioners, but also the students. I would say that it's affected everybody. Like the new virtual way we deliver our support has affected everybody. But just like with any situation that has a social or economic component, it affects people from minority groups a bit more. So a lot of people didn't have the means to access the learning virtually, let alone the branches of student support or mental health support. And it kind of made us hyper aware of some of the struggles we were almost oblivious to before the pandemic. Like I had students who didn't have equipment like laptops, or they were sharing equipment amongst several of their siblings, or they had one computer for the house, which was downstairs. So there was like no safe space for them to access calls through like Teams. And we know that there's a stigma attached to mental health globally, but again, more so in these minority groups. So they're normally the students that don't want to talk about these things in front of their family or their siblings. And that just means that an extra barrier can mean there's more resistance to accessing support, or people avoid accessing support. So I think that's the main thing, essentially, like people just didn't have a safe space or actually did not have the equipment. What I will say, because I always want to give a balanced perspective, is that we have been working on solutions to tackle these kind of things. So we have a hardship fund at my university, which we kind of opened up to make sure, before it was just like we give money to people that are struggling financially, but we've opened that up so people could actually, the university actually pays for equipment, so people can buy like laptops or get like better internet connection so they can access academic support, but also the mental health support we offer at the university. And it was just about being more flexible. Like before, it was very strictly face-to-face mental health support. I had never done, again, I've been doing assessments and interventions all my life, and I had never done anything over Teams or over the phone. And even at my university, it was very strictly face-to-face. If you can't make it, it's a DNA. But then we changed to like virtual meetings through Teams. And then we've even done like phone calls, because again, some people just have to kind of get out of the house to access that safe space. So we realized that any mental health support, any mental health contact is better than no contact. So there has been some kind of solutions. And yeah, that's my contribution to the topic.
Thank you, Deji. And I think we're going to touch on that first, about how this digitalization, this rapid change in support systems has affected particularly students from racialized minority backgrounds. But first, I just want to check again, is Selena Raw here? No? Okay, well, with that, I think we can begin with the panel discussion, and then if Celine pops up, then she can be free to engage as well. So we have a question in the chat, but before we get to that question, because I think it's important to address the solutions after we address some of the issues that might have arose. My question to the panel is, in light of COVID-19 and how we've changed to remote working, how services had to rapidly shift towards offering their support services online, as Deji's mentioned already, how do you think this digitalization has affected particularly groups from racialized minority backgrounds in regards to their mental health, their access, the sort of treatment they might receive, and so forth? And I'll go straight to you, Nikasi, first.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from my research and so I forgot to mention, I guess it is useful for context, I also work in residences as a wellbeing lead. So we support students living in our residences with mental health and wellbeing support. And the mental health need during the pandemic for those students who lived in the halls was incredibly high. We had a lot of students kind of effectively becoming carers for some of those students with severe mental illnesses that, you know, weren't able to access some of their support services because of, you know, the changing in having to go digitalized. Students were kind of, you know, left together to kind of support each other, which kind of meant that there was a lot of higher need, and the universities tried very hard to kind of address those needs. But of course, when you're kind of living, studying, working, living with strangers, moving out from home for the first time as like an 18-year-old, there's only so much support you can offer a student online. So we found that as much as we kind of tried, the 2 years was just a not fun 2 years. And kind of as Deji said, you know, whenever there's kind of any sort of natural disaster or there's any sort of like global unrest, the most minoritized will be the most affected by it. So the Black students and the other racialized minority students, they struggled a lot in those student accommodations because they were living with people, some were living with people who were racist. You know, that's not uncommon for racism to happen in student accommodations. We've kind of seen with the Unite report, definitely would urge anyone to read it, that racism is quite rife in student accommodations. But of course, kind of from the research I've done, you know, Black students kind of find each other, they find peer support groups, they find friends, family, other ways to support themselves. But during the pandemic, they weren't able to find that. They weren't able to kind of access that. So they ended up being kind of left to deal with racism, discrimination, harassment, you know, bullying, some abuse alone. And, you know, as much as we tried with digital support, it just wasn't enough. And that's something that's been highlighted in the United report as well. So on that front, it was a little bit doom and gloom. And I guess from the other side, it was kind of lucky is a weird word, but me and like the founder Yannick Elefende, when we were trying to create Black Students Talk, we were trying to create it online. It was kind of useful in the sense that everyone was trying to think of solutions at the same time. So I guess Black students for a really long time have been asking, and other minority students have been asking for online support for a while, and it's kind of been said that, you know, it doesn't work. But I think the pandemic kind of showed us that it is possible, that, you know, access needs can be met, just with the right motivation, apparently. So I guess, yeah, I know we'll talk about solutions a bit later, but I guess on the offside, it created, I guess, an environment where digital support was seen as more doable, and I guess more resources put to that. So in that sense, useful. So I guess, yeah, like Deji, trying to create a bit of a balance in the positives and the negatives that kind of came out from the digitalization.
Yeah, I'll just add to and Cassie, like give some contrast to what Cassie said. I actually work in a London university. It's an arts university, University Arts London. So it's not like a campus university. So just to add some context, a lot of the students are actually still living at home with their parents. So you can imagine, like I can imagine my story, what my story would have been if I went to university during lockdown or the pandemic. It would have been like, university was my respite away from my family home, and for them there's no getting away from that. They're stuck in the doors with their parents. They don't have the excuse of being able to go to university. That's kind of like they're compressed into that situation, and that in addition to not having the means to access the learning in the same way that other people do, and a bunch of other things that just come with the pandemic, kind of created a recipe for like them pushing them over the threshold to needing mental health support, but still not being able to kind of access that in the way they would have been if there was no pandemic. So we did a few things like to try and solve the problem. We kind of took a public health approach. We knew that after we had met a few students, we gauged that there was going to be a problem amongst our minority groups, and we kind of ran some workshops that everybody could kind of attend. So the focus wasn't on an individual. It's kind of like, this is a workshop for minority groups to kind of come and get some mental health awareness and then start to access the mental health support. But yeah, I guess I kind of answered the question you asked, Keisha, in my first statement, basically saying that it was bad in some areas because some people didn't have the means to access the support. But then again, I think somebody's put it in the chat, like some students would never actually come for a face-to-face meeting. And before the pandemic, we never actually offered that. So when we started to offer that, we started to get students that we never would have seen, like students that normally suffer with anxiety or social anxiety, don't really want to be outside of the house. So we've allowed them a space to kind of still access that support without having to leave the house. I guess that stretches beyond minority groups, but again, will affect us a bit more.
Perfect, thank you. And I've just been informed that Celine is here. So what I'll do is I'll introduce Celine very quickly, and I'll allow her to open up just with her statement about student mental health. And then we'll go into our next next question, and I'll particularly touch on a question that's in the chat. So Selena Roy is an assistant psychologist who has helped tens of thousands of people across the world with their mental health. After having her own mental health difficulties in 2016, while studying psychology at university, she realized how many people did not understand mental health issues and the many problems this was causing. This led Celine to create Solutions, a social enterprise creating solutions to the problems surrounding mental health. Celine is now an expert mental health wellbeing workshop facilitator and speaker, inspiring and teaching thousands of people across the world how to look after their mental health, particularly students. She also uses social media to make mental health education as accessible as possible, thus destigmatizing it. Hi, Celine.
Hi everyone.
Would you like to start by just giving a brief statement on the topic, and then we can go into our next question?
Yeah, sure. So is it just like my thoughts about student mental health? Yeah, so as you can see from the introduction, I'll just quickly just give a little summary about my experiences. So like it was mentioned, I did have my own issues with anxiety whilst I was at uni. And I found that a lot of the people at university were also struggling. So it's led me to create solutions. And immediately I went back to helping students look after their mental health, as I believe that there's such importance when it comes to looking after your mental health as a student. A lot of the time, the focus is on, just looking after your studies, but not really looking after yourself. So I made sure to kind of just teach people how to look after their mental health and just put an emphasis on student well-being. And that's how Solutions was created.
Perfect. Thank you for that background. So I guess my next question, and it kind of ties into Jenny's question. So if Jenny wishes, she can unmute herself and just expand on her own experiences. But we've talked a little bit about the digitalization of mental health services, and we're questioning whether they're effective or they're not effective. So I think what would be good is if we can expand on what some of those solutions have been. And Odeji, you've already touched upon them, and Nakasi, you also touched upon them, but expand on them and what has been the experiences you've heard from students using them. Do they find them advantageous? Do they find them unadvantageous? How have they been seen to be used or be implemented more widely in the university? And Jenny, I'll give you the opportunity. Do you want to unmute yourself and talk, or should I just read out your comments in the chat? I think you're speaking, but you're mute. Oh, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Okay. What I'll do is I'll read your comment in the chat. Is okay? Great. So Jenny said, one suggestion could be to approach bodies such as the Black and Asian Therapy Network, BATAN, and through them approach counsellors who are building up their hours and may be able to work voluntarily with students. However, you cannot get away from spending money on mental health, and often Black therapists are expected to keep on working for free. She said, students who would never come to my office for face-to-face meetings are accessing support digitally. And she comments that Deji's point about technological disadvantage is also very valid. And I also just want to quickly, whilst we're here, touch upon Fatima's question as well, which is what happens when we're supporting students of colour placed with same race students who are experiencing projected oppression? We are not always each other's allies. For me, it appears helpful to talk about internalized racism, boundaries, and assertive action, but what do others think? So I guess the first question is, well, what yet again are the methods and solutions we can use to support students? Have they been effective, particularly in this era of digitalization? And also, what is the actual dynamic that occurs when someone who is of a racialized minorities background is supporting students who are also experiencing perhaps the same oppression that they have always also experienced as well?
Yeah, I'll answer the first question. The second question takes a bit more thinking for me. But with regards to the first question, I think obviously we need to remember that we were kind of restricted by what was going on in the world. So it's not like we decided to make it totally virtual. I think now we're in a perfect space where we've had our lifetime of face-to-face interventions, face-to-face mental health support, and then we've gone to strictly virtual. And now we've got this hybrid approach where students can kind of pick now at my university whether you want a face-to-face or whether you want a virtual appointment. So I offer 4 assessments a week, and 4 of them are going to be virtual, 4 of them are going to be face-to-face. And there's some people that might try virtual first and then become comfortable to try face-to-face appointments. And there's some people that want to do face-to-face and maybe feel like it wasn't too comfortable and then try virtual. So we're in a very, very good space now where it's like you've kind of got the best of both ways. You can kind of pick and choose. And it normally is the case that people do become more comfortable and then prefer face-to-face down the line. Me as a practitioner, I definitely prefer face-to-face. I meet too many people. I do too many assessments in a week. Like I'm meeting like 20 people a week. So it just helps me meeting somebody face-to-face to kind of build that rapport and remember their stories. But yeah, that's one of the solutions we've got in place now. And then again, like the hardship fund that we have at my university, just the ability to get people the equipment so they can access the support in a different way. They aren't limited to coming onto campus. We're also lucky to be like a multi-campus university in London. So we have several different places where students can kind of meet us. And the flexibility that the pandemic made us kind of adapt has kind of expanded into that field as well, where now it's kind of like we're flexible on the location. So practitioners are kind of moving about from place to place. So yeah, I think there's a real awareness about just being as flexible and as elastic as possible to give students the best experience. Still working on it though, I would say that, like, still working on it for sure.
Thank you, Deji. And just to clarify for the second question, Fatima was referring to when students who are we're supporting is receiving oppressive behaviour from other students of colour. So essentially what we do or how we can manage or support those students. Nikasi, before we go to you, I wanted to ask Celine if you'd like to come in. Celine? Okay, we'll go to you, Nikasi, and then we'll come back to Celine.
Sure. Yeah, I guess in terms of the first question, I agree. Tends to be a lot of kind of ownership on Black and other racialized minority staff to kind of be the ones to support, and I'm guessing like therapists and like teaching staff, and it sounds like mental health staff were both kind of, that pressure was kind of put on them to be the support at universities, which it's completely burdensome, and it was completely and continues to be unpaid. I think in terms of like, it has to be kind of from a university level, in the sense that, you know, money was produced to be able to fund Black Students Talk, for example, like, and a lot of money, like OFS were able to kind of, I think, I mean, the funds are publicly accessible, I think, the information, but I think it was something like, it was definitely like millions basically was given to Student Mind to kind of fund various projects, and we were just lucky to be one of them. So the money's there, the resources are there, right? It's just about universities kind of, and I guess non-university services as well that work with universities to put the money where it needs to be put. Like, you know, we developed this intervention based on our own experiences, based on our work, based on our research. There are people out there who have the knowledge and expertise. It's just about kind of being able to resource and finance and, you know, hopefully take the pressure and the expectations off of the staff who are you know, not paid to do that work and also untrained. And I guess I've definitely seen from the students' perspective, there are students advocating more and more for, you know, universities to do more to support them. So I'm hoping that will lead to some changes over the next few years, fingers crossed. In terms of the second question, I'm making sure that I 100% get exactly what was said. Is it kind of like, in terms of like a student, let's say for example, a Black student comes up and says like a student from another race is kind of like being racist, or like being oppressive, or is it that, no, the same race? Okay, so is it more like the sharing of trauma basically? Okay.
Fatima, sorry Nikasi, I wonder if Fatima wanted to clarify or just maybe unmute herself just to clarify.
Said no, the same race in the comment.
Yes, it's the same race. So living together, placed together because somebody thought it was a good idea to place these students together because they would be a match. And it turns out that there is some oppressive behaviour happening. So we're not always each other's allies. Just because we put Black people together in accommodation, does that mean that we are going to be supporters of each other? In this case, it's not. It's turning quite, quite bad for the person I'm supporting. So it's, for me, I'm thinking about internalized racism that is going on and projected oppression, and how to kind of educate and support the person who's suffering, who wouldn't expect that to come from that source, if that makes sense.
That's a really good question. And that's also like, it's something I've seen quite a lot, in the sense that, students from the same minority group are always seen as kind of the same, like they'll get along because they're both like the same race, like completely ignoring the fact that, we're all individuals and there are many, 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 many identities that all of us have and show and don't show in different contexts. And I've seen that a lot at BST, and I've also seen it a lot in the accommodations. And I think one of the things that's so important is to like validate the fact that like you don't have to like this person, like you don't have to like support this person, you don't just because you're of the same race, you don't have to feel like you need to be that person's like educator or saver. I think we kind of other people and also us ourselves will kind of use a bit of guilt to kind of make us feel like we should be supporting other people because they are from the same race and we should all like love each other. But I think it's really important, especially for students who are going through so much like changes and like life like pressures and figuring out themselves, to kind of teach them how to be boundaried in themselves. You're discovering who you want, the kind of people you want in your lives, they're discovering the kind of adult they want to be, and a part of that is really important to think about the kind of people they want in their lives. And just because this person is of a similar race, it doesn't mean you have to kind of be with that person. Having said that, obviously there's that mentality of there's so few of us, you kind of feel like you want to kind of connect with that person. And I feel like Deji would probably be the best person to like speak about that from the mental healthy support side. And that's my way of saying, please Deji, come save me to answer the rest of that question.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think there's such a big conversation now about racial trauma and the interventions that surround that. And I think it's just, you need to be very mindful that just because somebody's the same race as you, it doesn't mean that they're gonna be the same as you on every spectrum or on every demographic variable. Like we differ quite a bit, so it's quite normal for people that are the same race to just not click, or for them to have the space to oppress you for another variable. Essentially, I think there's probably, what I would do there is there's probably a bit of psychoeducation that can be done to the student that's being kind of oppressed, I would say, on like racial trauma and just like experiencing racial trauma. And I guess there's another dimension there, like experiencing racial trauma from somebody who also looks like you. But yeah, definitely a scope for a bit of psychoeducation there.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to know, Celine, we haven't heard you speak, if you also wanted to add on the conversation about solutions for particularly racialized minority students when it comes to accessing these digitalized mental health support services, and also how the dynamic between supporting students who are of the same race but also might not necessarily find it easy to perhaps navigate the relationships or some sort of support system for each other.
I feel like Deji, that everything was said already. So I'd just like to echo that, about the psychoeducation for the people for people who are being oppressed, so giving them that psychoeducation. But on the side of making sure that this information is more accessible, moving things digitally, like again with the psychoeducation, so allowing this information to be accessed through different means, that's what I'll say.
Thank you so much, Celine. And I just want to say thank you to all the panelists for your time, Nikasi, Deji, and Celine. We really appreciate you being here today, and we hope you can stay on later for our networking event, just to get to meet some of the attendees and each other as well. But I'd give a little air clap for you all. Thank you so much. That was really insightful yet again, and widening the discussion around student mental health and how we can continue to support them in this rapidly changing era. So we're going to go now to a break, and this time it's going to be 10 minutes to let you all decompress. And then we'll come back for our very last discussion, which will be talking yet again about the digitalization of mental health services and how practitioners have supported their service users in response. So I'll see you back here at 7 o'clock. But with that, I'll say farewell and see you in a minute. Right, we're at 7 o'clock. Welcome back, everybody. And for this panel, I'd be really excited to introduce some, yet again, renowned guest speakers, and to also discuss our transition to digital mental health services in light of COVID-19. I'll wait for Idris to just share the slides. Oh yeah, he's got them up. So with that, I'll start by introducing Dr. Samantha Reynolds first. Dr. Samantha Reynolds is a clinical psychologist working in the NHS at a medium secure forensic unit in East London, and as a director of her private practice Abdo Therapy, delivering online individual therapy and facilitating workshops. Prior to her doctorate in clinical psychology, Dr. Reynolds also completed her PhD in psychology and neuroscience. Furthermore, she has written for media publications on topics of racism, community and wellbeing, with features in British Vogue, The Guardian, The Observer, and Vanity Fair. Welcome, Samantha.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Lovely to see you. Would you like to start by giving us your 5-minute opening statement?
Yeah, of course. So I'm just first of all really glad to be here and grateful to be invited to talk about this topic. As you mentioned, I do work in the NHS and also work outside the NHS in private practice, and my private practice work has all been online. So reflecting on the impact of transitioning to digital mental health services is actually felt like a really important topic, because that is the way in which a lot of mental health services are going now, both private and not, and seem to be staying that way. In thinking about the impact of this on access to services and the experience of mental health services, there were a few points that really stood out to me, particularly thinking about how transitioning to digitalised mental health services could have both a positive and a negative impact. So some of the positives that I've experienced in my work is that it increases access to I think resources that often might not be there because things like distance get in the way. We are fortunate enough to have across the country a large number of therapists that come from ethnic minority backgrounds, and not everyone, but in my experience, many people from minoritized ethnicities do value having access to a therapist who can relate to that. So having access to people across the country via digitalized mental health has definitely been a benefit for a lot of people. One of the huge downsides that I've also observed, though, has been around the challenges that you face trying to do some of the aspects of developing a therapeutic rapport and delivering specifically kind of culturally adapted interventions online. It's definitely not impossible. It can be done, but there are barriers there. And when I was thinking about the impact on therapeutic rapport and therapeutic relationship, because you do lose some aspect of the nonverbal when working online, it presents just an extra challenge. And now this is pertinent to people from minoritized ethnic backgrounds for a range of reasons. One of them being that for many people, it's the first time that they'll be accessing mental health services. So, and the therapeutic relationship is fundamental to feeling as though accessing these services is really meaningful, and to help it feel kind of worth engaging and going into exploring difficult topics, etc. So when there are barriers to being able to develop a therapeutic rapport in both directions, then that can be an aspect that can impact access for sure. I guess it's harder to know how much you can really trust someone when you're trying to establish who is this person I'm talking to online. And one of the second kind of aspects I mentioned was around culturally adapting some of our interventions. And I was thinking particularly about how some of the ways in which we can adapt our interventions when working with people from minoritized groups is really focusing a lot on the body. So for example, if we're working with racial trauma, really present now, I'm seeing more and more people access mental health services for the impacts of racial trauma, which I think is a really helpful thing. But a lot of that is it's a systemic problem and does affect us psychologically, but we can also embody a lot of that trauma. But trying to do some of those interventions and explore those feelings and those senses is different online, so we kind of lose some of the flavor, some of the essence of what it means to come together as minoritized people in a therapeutic context and to be able to share what almost feels like a bit of an energy exchange. It's different online, so that aspect of it as well is definitely impacted in the transition to digitalized mental health. I'm sure we'll talk further and I don't want to take up all the space, but yeah, that's just my initial thoughts.
Keisha, muted.
You're muted, Keisha.
Imagine after all these months of doing digitalized practice, I still make that rookie mistake. I was just saying thank you, Samantha, and I'd be really interested to know more about how we address the physiology in that therapeutic relationship and your experiences when it comes to digitalized mental health therapy. So next, I want to introduce Patricia Riley from Frontline Therapists. Patricia is an integrative counsellor currently training in psychosexual and relationship psychotherapy. She loves helping people, especially those from marginalised backgrounds, and has spent 25 years working in the NHS, of which the last 15 has been in various commissioning roles. She has a keen eye for detail and believes that clients should receive quality care. When not working, she enjoys bonding with her children, family and friends, walking, traveling, and learning. Hi, Patricia again.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. So looking at what we've done at Frontline Therapists, when we made the decision to move to online service at Frontline, we wanted to ensure that we could offer affordable ways for our clients to access counseling, psychotherapy, and counseling psychology via a local service. We have found that we are not just able to reach clients from here in the UK, but also across the world, other parts of the world. And as can be imagined, the pandemic has exacerbated many mental health issues during the lockdown, where face-to-face access to mental health services was not possible, causing concern for many people who were unsure as to how they will be able to manage their issues surrounding their own mental health at a time when it was actually being affected the most. So at Frontline, the therapists, we offer access via online, and we offer culturally sensitive therapy to those that need it. Our service has had numerous impacts, but for the purpose of this brief introduction, I will focus on only 4 of the profound impact that we have had. This including working exclusively with clients and counselors that are from the same communities as the people that they're serving. We provided access to mental health services before the pandemic, during pandemic, and post-pandemic, as well as in the current climate that we're in. As I'd mentioned earlier, not just in the UK, but people globally. We provide low-cost counselling service, which makes it affordable for people that are on benefit, people on low income who otherwise would be at a disadvantage of gaining access to counselling services. As they work both long-term and short-term, covering a range of issues. And as we know, most third sector services don't offer long-term therapy. I will stop here for now. I'm sure more questions will come.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for being here. And I can already see this common theme arising around how Digitalisation has supported access, you mentioned about across the world, and Samantha also talked about how many individuals who might have not have accessed it before can do so. So I think that might inform one of my first questions to you. But before I do that, I also lastly want to introduce Vanessa Boichi. Vanessa is the founder of Inside Out UK and has been working in mental health for 7 years and is particularly interested in using culturally sensitive approaches to work with individuals who are experiencing depression, anxiety, social anxiety, low self-esteem, life transitions, hardships, and trauma. Vanessa's focus is on supporting people to overcome their psychological barriers by exploring the underlying factors that are hindering their peace and by implementing practical strategies and techniques to enhance the quality of life through one-to-one sessions and group workshops. It's lovely to have you here, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and lovely to be here too. And thank you for all the speakers that have come before me as well. It's been really, really insightful to hear from you all. So I guess I'd like to start my statement by talking about the importance of improving access to mental health support. So I guess similar to most of the speakers here today, I work in the public service. So I work within the NHS, but I also work, I guess, running my organisation Inside Out Wellbeing, which is a community-based social enterprise, and we aim to improve access to mental health services. So as an insight has already been given into, I guess, doing one-to-one support and improving access to that digitally, I think it'll be good for me to give a bit of an insight into, I guess, improving access to community-based digital mental health services. So I guess with my introduction and with my passion into improving access, it started back in 2000 and around 2016 actually, and one of the things that I really noticed was that there wasn't really much being done to provide, I guess, draw that links between mental health professionals and the services that they're providing and I guess the community as well. So people from racialized communities, there's a bit of a gap that I noticed there. And that's what I guess informed my my passion for being able to set up Inside Out. So I remember I did an event, and this event was to, I guess, improve awareness and increase awareness around mental health. And that community-based event, so even just following from doing a really short event, people were interested and were asking me, Vanessa, when is the next one happening? When's the next one? And at that point, I was thinking, wait, there's meant to be a next one? Okay, let's do a next one. So that's what almost fed into me being able to do more workshops, more community-based events. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, where these events where we would do in-person activities, we would merge creativity with psychoeducation, which is something that I think is so important, so fundamental. All of a sudden that was stripped away from us, where we're going from being able to feel the energy of people in the room to now feeling the energy of people over a laptop. Or a computer, so a completely different dynamic. And you know, initially that almost brought up a bit of a few challenges. Well, I initially thought that it would bring up some challenges for us at Inside Out Wellbeing, but it actually was the opposite, where there was lots of people wanting to access support as well. So I think that just honed in on the importance of being adaptable to providing services. And you know, as much as the pandemic has brought a lot of struggles and a lot of difficulties as well, I believe there's also been a bit of a silver lining in there as well, where we have been able to use digital services to provide not just one-to-one support, but also community-based, culturally sensitive support as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I take on board that point you said about having to feel energy across the computer. That's the change that has enacted because of this digitalization of mental health services, but also the positives that we see regarding access. I think that leads me into my first question, although all of the panelists have touched on this quite extensively already. And it's around, yet again, whether or not there has been change in accessing mental health service, but particularly from individuals from racialized or ethnic minority groups. Because as we know, an independent review of the Mental Health Act by the African and Caribbean Group has found that Black people are less likely to come into contact with mental health services. And this is also the same for Asian groups. And this occurs through via GPs or talking therapies. And they're also less likely to be offered psychological therapies. So I guess with the COVID-19 pandemic and also the extent to which people were trying to access services during this period, do we think that the digitalization actually supported individuals when they're accessing talking therapies or psychological therapies through GPs in getting that support? Was there a change and so forth? And
starting off.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so from working in, like I mentioned, I work in the public service, and I also work privately with my organization as well. And one of the first things that we noticed straight off the bat was people were not actually accessing services. So there was a huge dip in referrals, which was quite surprising, taking into account that, of course, everyone has been through a stressful time. We're all going through a difficult experience. So we would have imagined that there'll be more people accessing services. So when we looked into it a little bit more, it came down to something so minute that it's really even quite interesting how we missed it. It came down to the fact that people didn't even know that services were still available. So there was that lack of awareness that these services are still available digitally as well. So from there, we decided to put together, I guess, a campaign using social media in order to, I guess, highlight that, okay, of course, we're in a pandemic, we're not able to see each other face to face. However, that doesn't mean that the support stops there. We are able to, like I mentioned earlier on, adapt to the circumstances that we have been given and use, online resources such as Zoom, Microsoft Teams to be able to provide, these services. Of course, like I mentioned earlier on, it may not necessarily be the same. So for instance, with our workshops that we were doing in person at Inside Out, we would have our Inside Out family dinner. There'll be food, everyone will come and eat. There'll be diffusers, we'll be able to engage in things physically. So imagine going from doing something that is so community-based, interaction-led, to then trying to adapt to that online. There would have been some challenges there as well. But I still do believe that as much as things weren't exactly the same as they were in person, afterwards, through pushing the message and using, I guess, public health resources to allow people to know that, okay, yes, these services are still available. I think that was really helpful as well. And there was even a campaign that I was part of called the Every Minds Matters campaign. I'm not sure if people here have come across it. And again, that was about letting people know that these services are available. So all in all, I think it came down to something so simple, just awareness, just knowing that, okay, there's somewhere that I can go to during this time.
Thank you, Vanessa, and for highlighting that simple issue that was the awareness of these mental health services to individuals during the COVID-19 pandemic. Samantha and Patricia, I wondered if you also wanted to add to this discussion around whether or not we are seeing a difference for racialized minority groups in accessing therapy through GPs or talking therapies, or at least being referred to them after or in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the digitalization that's occurred.
Okay. In terms of referrals to GP or from our clients, they self-refer, we've certainly noticed an increase. Requiring for the recruitment of 2 counseling managers last year alone, and we're now holding waiting lists. So yes, there's increase, and people are accessing the service a lot more than before the COVID.
Just to add to that, I guess a different angle from an NHS perspective, I work in an inpatient context, so there's not so much I can kind of bring to that because it's not a referral process. and Abode was started during the pandemic. So again, can't so much speak to change, but what I can speak to is what people have shared to me kind of qualitatively through our discussions about coming to therapy. And my experience has been, not for everyone, but for a lot of people, they've found using the service online to have had one step removed by, for example, not having to travel. It's now just quite convenient. And I've also noticed that, especially for people who may find therapy is challenging, right? But for some people who may find it particularly difficult to kind of get up and get going at the beginning, not having to do that journey after work or not having to be on the other side of London or anything, has been something that's allowed them to just think, all right, you know what, I'm just going to enter the meeting, I'll just do it, instead of cancelling. And often they've been happy that they've done that. So that has allowed a bit of an increase in access. Saying that, I will suspect that there are a lot of people, both in minoritized ethnic groups, but also in the general population, who just for technology isn't their forte as such. And so for them, when there was more of a reliance on digitalized access to mental health, it probably just wasn't a particularly helpful change. And I'm not sure if there's any data kind of on how minoritized ethnic groups have been specifically impacted by that, but it's just a factor that I think should be considered as well.
Thank you. And before I go on to the next question, I want to read a comment that's just come in the chat about on this topic. So Jenny, she says, a key area is supporting people to access services. It is not that people don't want help, it's that they are not aware of those services, as Vanessa mentioned as well. I've been supporting clients by going to meetings with GPs to ask for referrals to therapy, which Samantha mentioned, and it has been a struggle to get GPs to have face-to-face meetings with their clients. So I guess this kind of nicely leads into my next question about the disadvantages that's possibly been experienced, or the negatives. And I guess this links into a point that Samantha raised very early on, which is with people accessing mental health services or therapy, racialized minority groups, perhaps there's this need or expectation to have culturally adapted therapy that is sensitive to them, things that are not already offered through the NHS or through GPs or through talking therapies. And with the arising awareness of culturally sensitive or culturally adapted techniques, I guess some people might be lucky enough to have those services available to them. But for those that aren't, how do they experience therapy in a digitalized format? Are they able, what is your experience of offering that culturally adapted therapy? Has that been difficult? Has it not been difficult? What sort of services are available to also teach practitioners to offer those services as well? I would let anyone just come in as well, just to answer the question.
I'm happy to start, perhaps just kind of expanding on my initial point around some of the challenges, and one of those been the cultural adaptation, particularly kind of thinking about embodied interventions. I guess when I was thinking about this point, I was thinking about how, let's say we are bringing in the impact of trauma and where it's stored in the body, what it feels like, how we begin to use breath and movement to manipulate that, the impact of that, to then also free up, I guess, a bit of headspace to be able to think about the other aspects, the cognitive aspects, make new decisions, etc. We might start doing things like breathing together. You might start doing things like moving together, and kind of me standing up in this space being like, let's do something here. It's just not the same. If we think even from a neuropsychological perspective about how me starting to regulate my breath to assist you to regulate your breath, thinking about mirror neurons being activated and enabling someone to engage in the same regulating behavior and find impact in that. It's just not the same online. And that's where I think something is really lost. There's a richness that is lost, and almost like a physical connection that I don't have a better word than energy that also gets lost. I know Vanessa kind of spoke to that too. And I do think this energy, this physical connection, as well as the emotional connection, the psychological connection that you have between kind of therapy client, it's just as important for there to be, I guess, an impactful, meaningful change. And that's something that I really feel like is lost. I wouldn't say it's impossible to do this stuff, but it's just not the same. And I haven't found anything that's given a perfect guide around that to create the same environment. Perhaps it's just not possible. But that's also something that I found it's really possible to be open with people about, and just explain, this is what we'll be doing, this is what we're getting into, this is what it might be like if we were to do this in person, etc.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. And I think just to add on to what Samantha said, one of the challenges that I have seen from doing one-to-one support with people as well is even just something as simple as being in a confidential environment where the person and the individual feels comfortable to offload and comfortable to talk. Some people might be, they might not have their own private spaces, they might be sharing spaces as well. So even something as simple as being able to just talk can be quite hard for them. And if, for instance, their home environment is a place where they've experienced trauma or experienced some sort of difficulty, where they've got that association with the place that they're in and the difficulties that they're experiencing, it may be the case where even just going out for therapy is something that is quite relieving for them. So I guess the downside of doing, for some people anyway, having therapeutic services within their homes is that they're not able to make that distinction, and they're not able to make that separation between the two. And so I guess that therapeutic process becomes more challenging and more difficult as well. Not to say that there isn't ways around that, but of course it can be quite challenging as well.
Thank you. And just to add to the points that's been already covered, we'll always have clients that will have a preference anyway for face-to-face. But when we have people who are challenged when it comes to mobility, and our service where it is global, it's a given that they don't expect to have face-to-face, and they appreciate having access to culturally sensitive therapy from wherever it is that they're coming from. So there's benefit as well as some of the challenges that's already been raised.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, right, sorry, I swapped computers. I think the other things I wanted to say is that working with clients, when it comes to the NHS, I think that they feel there's a pressure on them to just take whatever they can get. And it's like, oh, if you're lucky if you can see someone, but because I work as a mental health advocate supporting people, but as a counsellor working for as an integrative counsellor, I can offer long-term therapy, and clients are quite happy to say, I want to see a Black counsellor, Black woman, Black lesbian, whatever you ask for within that context, they feel more confident asking for that, but they would never do that with the NHS, because it's like, well, I'm lucky if I even get to see someone. So I think there's a whole thing about the way, because it's such a big organization, the NHS, and the way they operate, it just feels like people think, well, I can't ask for someone in particular because the system isn't really set up for me to do that.
I think it, just to add to that as well, I think it depends on what service it is. So for instance, I've worked in a service, in the IUP service in South London, and there is the option to actually request for a particular type of therapist. So if you did want to have a Black female therapist, that's an option that is available. But that's only something that has been introduced recently. And it's interesting because it only got introduced following from, George Floyd's situation as well. So it's quite interesting how that wasn't something that was already in place, just that request. But I completely understand that there may even be some NHS services where, therapists from racialized communities, are not even present itself. So it'll be quite difficult to actually match up everyone's request. So yeah, I think it's something that now anyway, more services are starting to introduce.
I think your sound's cut out, Vanessa.
Lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Any better? Okay. So I was just saying that there are some services that do offer that option as well, but of course there's still a long way to go with being able to, match up people with their preferences. I know that there's some services that don't even give people the option as well, just like you mentioned. So I think you really touched upon an important point there.
Yeah. And when you do offer it, I mean, working as a counsellor, and on my profile, I specifically say that I do work with kind of diverse groups and LGBTQ people and so on. And the clients want that, and they come forward, and I'm busy. So that there is that people want that, but I think they feel that but it's not necessarily something that it would. Someone said to me, "Oh well, I've already waited this long. How long will I wait if I specifically say I want to work with a Black therapist or a Black psychiatrist or something?" It's not easy.
Yes, thank you, Jenny, for your additions as well. And I guess there's a comment in the chat, and I think this conversation is kind of leaning towards this as well, which is the burden that's often put sometimes on Black or racialized minority therapists or psychiatrists and psychologists. And I don't know if Natalie wants to unmute herself just to read her point or to ask a question. If not, I can read what she put in the chat. No? Okay, well, I'll read her comment. And she says, another key issue is people not wanting to be a burden to services. She said this was particularly evident during the pandemic when lots of the messaging about how overworked staff were. So I guess just to kind of wrap up this discussion, I would ask or put to the panelists from either your own experience or what you've seen, which is how has it been as a mental health practitioner or professional supporting various individuals via digitalized format who are yet again also experiencing something you might be with regards to racial trauma or oppression or any sort of distress, as well as also supporting them or experiencing it at the same time. And what sort of burden do you think exists as well on these practitioners in the spaces as well? Does anyone want to go first? I think Samantha or Patricia, you had your mic on mute there.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm going to answer the question directly, but just speaking to Natalie's comment and the idea of burden during the pandemic, I think that that it's a really important point because it was, I guess, the whole campaign of the country was like poor NHS, and it was poor NHS. It was reasonable, understandably, but there wasn't nuance given in that. So the idea, and then you add on what was happening in terms of the increased awareness of racism, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, all of that, the impact on Black people was seen. So I think I'm just agreeing it was very real. And if particularly for people who perhaps already find it challenging to share because they're worried about the impact on other people. I think it was a really difficult time. What I also observed was, and I don't know if this came up in an earlier panel, because I wasn't able to join earlier, but was lots of my colleagues and other clinicians I know working really carefully to take care of themselves during the time so that they could be available and present in a therapeutic context when possible for them, and then when not, trying to be really boundaried about that, because there's an awareness that you have to look after yourself in order to be able to support other people. And generally speaking, people were able to understand that. I think it's difficult though, because it's hard to step away when you know that you're supporting other people and other people are going through the similar sorts of stuff. There was a lot of pressures pulling in a lot of different directions at the same time with the pandemic and Black Lives Matter and everything.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I guess from my experience as well, so during that time, we were running workshops on, I guess, supporting people who are experiencing racial trauma and coping with racial trauma as well. And so it was a quite interesting time because on one hand, of course, like we've mentioned already, I was going through that experience. I was also in it with everyone, but then also supporting and facilitating those workshops as well. Just like Samantha mentioned, during that time for me, self-care was fundamental. Otherwise, I would have been pouring out of an empty cup, which at times, not going to lie, it almost felt that way. And so being able to make sure that I'm being supported so that I can then support other people, I think that was something that was quite fundamental as well, especially when it's almost like during that time, we started adapting materials, adapting treatment to be able to support people. So you're doing that work, you're adapting the treatment, but then you're adapting the treatment to support other people, but then using that to support yourself as well. So it was quite a challenging time, but I think the most important thing was just being supported, and for the people who were attending our workshops, them knowing that, okay, these people that are supporting us, they have also been through and they're currently going through that experience as well, but they're also giving us I guess a therapeutic lens. And I think that made it more wholesome and made it more warming and more therapeutic as well, the fact that we're all going through this experience together.
And I second everything that has been said so far.
Thank
I don't know
you.
if you can hear me.
We can hear you, Patricia.
Can you hear me at all?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm hearing none.
We can hear you, Patricia.
I can't hear anything.
Oh. Well, with that, I think whilst Patricia's figuring out her mic, can you hear us now? Okay. What I'll do is I'll read out, just to kind of wrap up this conversation, a comment in the chat from Angela. And she said, I think as much as it is important that people have access to therapists that understand their cultural background, there is this tendency for mainstream services to just forward racialized clients to their people, and she put their people in quotation marks, without actively learning and understanding cultural sensitivity. And she said that she finds this issue comes up a lot in her own doctoral thesis. And then we have another comment. So just because a therapist is from the same race, it does not necessarily mean they have the knowledge and understanding of cultural sensitivity. So, Patricia, did you want to? Okay. Yeah. So I guess to wrap up this conversation, I think if anyone of the panel has any thoughts or comments just on those last points before we close.
Just the final thing that I wanted to say, I think there was a question earlier on that we didn't touch upon around, I guess, therapists who want to access culturally sensitive support or culturally sensitive training per se. There's a training course that I did called the Tree of Life Narrative Therapy. I'm sure many people would have come across it. Absolutely amazing. Highly recommend if there are professionals who are interested in getting trained in a culturally sensitive way, then that's something that I would recommend. I'll try and find a link so I can pull it in the chat as well so people can also access it. But yeah, highly recommend, really good.
Thank you for that. And with that, I just want to say yet again another thank you to our panelists, Samantha, Vanessa, and Patricia, for being here today. That was yet again a very interesting conversation around culturally sensitive treatment and being delivered, not digitalized, but also the positives and the negatives, and also think about how we move forward with the therapy that we provide to our service users. So I'll give another virtual clap for Samantha, Patricia, and Vanessa. And with that, I think we're going to go straight into our networking event. So please do stay on. In spite of all the conversations we've had, we think it's always nice to kind of wrap up with just an opportunity to debrief one another, to talk about what we've learned today, to introduce ourselves to one of each other. Because one thing at the BiPP Network we're passionate about is making sure that individuals from racialized minorities communities, whether they're mental health professionals or students, are able to build those networks in the field, because we know they are very important. So I'm going to hand over to Idris to introduce our portion of this event and share his screen.
All right. Hello, everyone. So for this last part of the mental health conference, we're going to have a networking event. So the way this is going to take place is we're all going to be randomly assigned to different breakout rooms, and we will be spending 10 minutes in these rooms. And over these 10 minutes, we're going to be answering the following questions. So we would like to see people share with each other what's their name, what are they studying, and work that they're doing, any sort of advice that they've received, and what's the fact that people would not expect from you, and also what would you give to your younger self as an advice. These questions are going to be obviously shared within. I mean, hopefully you guys can take notes of these questions so that you can refer to them in your specific breakout rooms. But if that's all really. So I'm going to get everyone into the room now and see you guys there. So after the 10 minutes, we're going to come back to the main space and then reshuffle again so that you get a chance to meet more than one group of people. Thank you.